Welcome back to Velvet Confessions. If this is your first time here, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We tell the stories that polite people pretend never happened. And before we get into today's story, drop a comment below and let us know what city you're watching from. We have listeners all over Canada, and honestly, it never gets old seeing your cities pop up in the comments. Now, today's story. She didn't announce it quietly. She didn't pull him aside and whisper. She walked into that fundraising gala on Marcus Holt's arm in a dress the color of a fresh bruise, deep plum, backless, chosen with intention, and she smiled at every person in that room like the decision had already been made, and the paperwork was just a formality. Her name was Natasha Verne. She was 31. She had spent 14 months being the kind of secret that a man keeps in a separate phone. And she had decided, sometime around the third week of October, that she was done being a secret. Marcus had told her the gala was safe, that his wife wouldn't be there, that Claire had her own obligations that evening, a board meeting for the Aldridge Foundation that she chaired, the kind of commitment that couldn't be rescheduled. And Natasha had believed him because Marcus had a way of presenting facts like they were gifts, and she had a way of accepting them without looking too closely at the wrapping. What neither of them fully understood, what Marcus, in particular, had spent 3 years carefully not thinking about, was that the Aldridge Foundation had established by Claire's grandfather, that the board meeting Claire chaired was held in a room on the 14th floor of a building that bore her family's name on the outside in letters 6 feet tall, and that when the foundation's annual gala fell on the same evening as a competing event at the Fairmont on King Street, the board meeting had the flexibility to end early. It almost always did. The Aldridge family did not rush, but they were never in the end late. Claire Aldridge Holt was 42 years old, and she had spent most of her adult life being described in terms that belonged to other people. She was Gerald Aldridge's daughter. She was the face of the Aldridge Foundation. She was Marcus Holt's wife. She had a talent for walking into rooms and making other women feel underdressed without doing anything in particular, which some people found intimidating and others found infuriating, and which Claire herself had stopped thinking about somewhere around the age of 35. She was not by nature a dramatic person. Her assistant, Dana, had called her at 7:40 that evening. The board meeting had wrapped up 20 minutes ahead of schedule, which was unusual but not unprecedented. Dana had been with Claire for 6 years. She knew Claire's calendar, her preferences, her family, and because good assistants always know more than they let on, she knew approximately where Marcus had been spending his Tuesday and Thursday evenings for the past several months. Dana said, simply, "The meeting wrapped early. The car is ready if you'd like to go on to the Fairmont." Claire had been standing at the window of the 14th floor boardroom, looking out at the city. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Tell them to pull around." She did not call Marcus. She did not send a text. She picked up her clutch, navy understated, the kind of bag that costs more than most people's rent but announces nothing. And she walked to the elevator. Her father was still in the building. Gerald Aldridge, 71 years old, with the posture of a man who had never once in his life felt he needed to hurry, was in a conversation with 2 other board members near the coat check. He saw Claire come off the elevator. He looked at her face for exactly 1 second. Then he said to the 2 board members, "Excuse me," in a tone that ended the conversation immediately, and he walked over to his daughter. "The Fairmont?" he said. "If you're not tired," Claire said. Gerald Aldridge picked up his coat. "I'm not tired." The gala was for the Children's Literacy Alliance of Ontario. It was the kind of event where a table cost $15,000, and the salmon was excellent, and everyone knew everyone else's net worth within a margin of about 10%. Marcus had been on the planning committee for 3 years running, which meant he had a seat near the front and the social permission to move around the room freely, greeting people, shaking hands, being the version of himself that he had spent a long time building. He was good at events like this. He was charming in the specific way of a man who had learned early that charm was a form of currency, and he had never stopped spending it. Natasha stood beside him, and felt for the first time all evening the particular discomfort of a person who has walked into a situation they didn't fully map out in advance. The room was not responding the way she'd expected it to raise. She had expected some whispers, maybe, some raised eyebrows, the low-grade electricity of a social scandal in progress. What she got instead was something harder to read. People looked at her and then looked away with a speed that wasn't dismissiveness, exactly. It was more like the careful blankness of people who already knew something she didn't. A woman at the table to her left, 50s, silver hair cut close, the kind of woman whose name appeared on hospital wings, glanced at Natasha's hand on Marcus's arm and then sent a text to someone across the room. Natasha noticed but didn't process it. She should have processed it. Marcus was talking to someone from the planning committee, a man named David, who was laughing, a little too loudly, at something that hadn't been particularly funny. Natasha smiled when she was supposed to smile. She sipped her champagne. She was wearing the plum dress and the shoes she'd bought specifically for tonight, and she had told herself that by the end of the evening, the ambiguity would be over. She had thought about this a great deal. She had rehearsed certain conversations. She had imagined the look on Marcus's face when he realized she wasn't going to be tucked away anymore, and she had decided she was at peace with the consequences of that. She had not, at any point in this planning, thought very carefully about Claire. This was the mistake, not the affair, not the decision to attend the gala. The mistake was that Natasha Verne had spent 14 months thinking of Claire Holt as an obstacle rather than a person, and in doing so, she had dramatically underestimated what she was dealing with. She knew the basic facts. Claire was the only child of Gerald Aldridge. The Aldridge family had built their fortune over 3 generations in commercial real estate and private equity. The kind of money that doesn't need to show off because it's never not there. She knew that Marcus's firm, Holt Capital, had benefited enormously from Aldridge connections. She knew that the Fairmont itself had been partially financed by an Aldridge-affiliated development group 15 years ago. She knew all of this the way you know something you've decided not to think about. What she didn't know, what Marcus himself had, perhaps never fully articulated, was that Holt Capital's single largest institutional client was an Aldridge family holding. That 2 of Marcus's 3 most significant recent deals had been facilitated through Gerald Aldridge's network. That the lease on the firm's Bay Street offices ran through a property management company that Gerald's younger brother controlled. Marcus knew this, technically. He just had a remarkable capacity to believe, simultaneously, that he was a self-made man, and that these facts were simply the natural background of a successful life. He had never sat down and done the math on what it would mean to be on the wrong side of this family. It had seemed, until recently, like information he would never need. Claire arrived at the Fairmont at 8:52. She did not enter through the main doors with a team of people or make any kind of announcement. She checked her coat, accepted a glass of water from a passing waiter, not champagne, water, and stood for a moment near the entrance to the main ballroom, taking in the room. Her father stood beside her. He was not there to act. Gerald Aldridge had not said a single word about Marcus or Natasha or what was about to happen. He was there because his daughter had asked him to come, and he had come. It was, in its way, the loudest thing he could have done. People noticed them within seconds. Not because they made a scene. They made no scene at all, but the Aldridge name in any room in this city had a specific gravity. Heads turned. A woman near the bar said something quietly to her husband, who straightened his jacket without thinking. The man from the planning committee, David, saw Gerald Aldridge from across the room and had the particular experience of a person whose brain is trying to reconcile 2 things at once. Marcus saw his father-in-law first. He was mid-sentence. Something about Q4 projection, something that didn't matter. And he stopped. Not dramatically, he just stopped. The way an engine stops when the key is turned, the momentum still carrying the car a few feet forward before everything goes still. Natasha felt him stop. She followed his gaze. She saw Claire. Claire, who was not supposed to be here. Claire, who had a board meeting. Claire, who was wearing a dress the color of winter ice, pale gray, long, with the kind of quiet authority that doesn't need to try, and who was standing next to her father with the absolute composure of a woman who has had several hours to decide how she feels about the next 20 minutes. Natasha's hand, still on Marcus's arm, did not move. But something in her chest shifted, the way a building settles when something structural gives way. Claire did not walk toward them immediately. She walked toward a woman named Patricia Sung, who sat on the board of the Children's Literacy Alliance and who had known Claire since they were in the same cohort at Osgood Hall Law School. They embraced. They talked for several minutes. Claire laughed at something Patricia said. Genuinely, fully, the laugh of a person who is present in a conversation. Across the room, Marcus watched this and understood, for the first time, that he was in a great deal of trouble. Not because Claire was angry. He could have managed anger. He had managed anger before. He had a whole vocabulary for navigating emotional conversations, a set of phrases and gestures he had developed over years that could de-escalate almost anything. What he could not manage, what he had no vocabulary for, was this. Claire at ease. Claire unhurried. Claire laughing with Patricia Sung, while Gerald Aldridge stood 12 feet away, making quiet conversation with two men, who, Marcus now recalled, were both partners at the firm that handled Aldridge Capital's legal work. He was not being confronted, he was being witnessed. And somehow that was worse. Natasha said quietly, "Maybe we should go." Marcus did not respond. "Marcus, give me a minute," he said. She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was watching his father-in-law, who had not looked at Marcus once since entering the room, and who was currently nodding thoughtfully at something one of the lawyers had said, with the expression of a man who has all the time in the world. The plum dress felt different than it had 30 minutes ago. Natasha was not someone who frightened easily, and she was not frightened exactly. But she was aware of something she hadn't been aware of before. The specific weight of a room full of people who all know each other, and who are all, right now, watching a situation they have already made up their minds about. She thought about how many of the people in this room did business with Gerald Aldridge. She thought about it with a clarity that had not been available to her before tonight. Claire came to them at 9:15. She didn't approach from across the room. She simply finished her conversation with Patricia and moved naturally through the crowd, pausing once to say hello to a couple near the bar, and then she was there, beside them, 3 feet away. She looked at Natasha first, not with hostility, not with the hot, trembling fury of a betrayed woman. That was not who Claire was, and even if it had been, this was not the place she would have chosen for it. She looked at Natasha the way a person looks at a stranger who has walked into their house and made themselves comfortable. With a kind of factual assessment, not without intelligence, not without a certain acknowledgement of the other person's presence. Then she looked at Marcus. "I wasn't expecting to make it," she said. "The meeting ended early." Marcus said, "Claire, Patricia tells me they hit their fundraising goal tonight," Claire said. "That's good. They were 800,000 short last year." Her voice was perfectly even, not cold, not warm. Even the way a line drawn with a ruler is even, without variation, without judgment, without anything you could grab onto. Marcus looked like a man trying to remember lines from a play he hadn't rehearsed. "I can explain." "You don't need to explain anything tonight," Claire said. And then, because she was not a cruel person, because the point had already been made, and making it sharper would have served no one, she turned to say hello to someone who had just appeared at her shoulder, and the conversation was over, just like that. Over. Natasha stood in the residue of it. She had imagined many versions of this meeting. She had imagined weeping. She had imagined raised voices. She had imagined a moment of clarity where everyone said the true thing, and the situation resolved into something she could understand. She had not imagined this. She had not imagined being looked at, assessed, and set aside, not with hatred, not even with contempt, but with the particular finality of a woman who had already done her grieving somewhere else and had come here with a different purpose entirely. Gerald Aldridge crossed the room at 9:30. The crowd moved the way crowds move around people who don't need to ask for space. Not suddenly. Not with any drama, but in that continuous unconscious way that speaks to something older than social convention. He walked toward Marcus, and the people between them simply weren't there anymore. He stopped in front of his son-in-law. He did not look at Natasha. "Marcus," he said. "Gerald." Marcus's voice was careful. "I wasn't expecting," Gerald said. 2 sentences, that was all. The simplest possible statement of fact. But in those 2 sentences was the entire architecture of the situation, laid out without ornamentation. Claire had asked. Gerald had come. The sequence of events that would follow from this evening was not yet spoken, but it was as settled as anything in this room. More settled, perhaps, than the marble floors or the crystal chandeliers, because those things had been built by contractors and could theoretically be undone. What Gerald Aldridge set in motion moved more quietly and was considerably harder to stop. Marcus understood this. He had understood it, on some level, for years. He had simply believed, had needed to believe, that it would never become relevant. That the life he had built alongside the Aldridge network was still fundamentally his own. "I'd like to find time to talk," Gerald said. "Early next week, my office, not a question." Gerald Aldridge did not ask questions in situations like this one. "Of course," Marcus said. Gerald nodded once. He looked at Marcus for one more second. Not with anger, and not with satisfaction, but with the expression of a man confronting a straightforward problem that he has the means and the intention to resolve. And then he turned and walked back toward his daughter. Natasha left at 9:45. She didn't announce it. She found her coat, she took an elevator to the lobby, and she stood outside the Fairmont on King Street while November did what November does in Toronto. And she thought about the past 14 months. She thought about the things Marcus had told her, about how the situation was temporary, about how he was working toward something, about how Claire was not the kind of woman who would make a scene, which he had presented as though it were a reassurance, and which Natasha now understood had been a description of something far more specific than she'd recognized. Claire was not the kind of woman who would make a scene because she didn't need to, because the scene had never been hers to make. Natasha flagged a cab. She got in. She watched the city go by outside the window, the lights going across the glass, the lights going across the glass, and she thought about a word Marcus had used once early on when he was explain their lives, the way explain their lives, when they want you to understand them without giving up too much. He had called Claire established. He'd said it almost fondly. The way you'd describe a place you'd lived a long time, comfortable, familiar, known. He had said it in a way that was meant to make Claire sound static, fixed in place, a part of the background. Natasha understood now what he had not. Established was not a synonym for passive. Established meant something had been building for a long time and had not finished building yet. Established meant the roots went down far enough that you couldn't see where they ended. The meeting in Gerald Aldridge's office happened on a Tuesday. It lasted 40 minutes. Gerald's assistant brought water and then left and closed the door. Gerald sat behind his desk, the same desk he had sat behind for 26 years, walnut, uncluttered, the kind of desk that makes other people feel the weight of what they're about to say before they say it. Marcus had prepared. He had spent the weekend preparing, working through frameworks, rationals, the language of managed transition and mutual respect. He had told himself that Gerald was a pragmatist, that pragmatists could be appealed to with logic, that there was a version of this conversation that resulted in an arrangement, a détente, some pathway through. He believed this until the moment Gerald spoke. Gerald did not begin with recrimination. He did not reference Natasha or the gala or any specific event. He opened a folder, cream-colored, thin, and he spent 11 minutes walking through 3 items: the renewal terms on Holt Capital's office lease, which were coming up in February, the status of the Morrison Group account, which was an Aldridge affiliate, and which represented 31% of Holt Capital's annual revenue, and a third item, a co-investment clause in a partnership agreement from 2019 that Marcus had signed and apparently not read with sufficient care. Marcus listened. He understood, by item 2, that the conversation he had prepared for was not the conversation that was happening. He understood by item 3 that there was no framework, no rationale, no pathway through that looked anything like the life he had been living. "Claire is my daughter," Gerald said, when he had closed the folder. Not a statement of emotion, a statement of fact, in the same register as everything else he had said that morning. Clear, unornamented, freighted with the full weight of what it meant in this specific context. "I think you understand the rest." Marcus understood the rest. He drove back to the Bay Street office in a car that still had his name on the parking spot, and he sat in the underground garage for 6 minutes before going inside. And he thought about a conversation he'd had with Claire 5 years ago, early in their marriage, when she had told him. Not as a warning, just as a statement of fact, the way she said most things, that her family did not stop caring about outcomes simply because the immediate circumstances changed. He had thought she meant something about loyalty, something generous. He had not understood she was also describing happened when loyalty was broken. Claire moved out of the house in early December. This was her choice, made deliberately, on a timeline she controlled. She took what was hers, which was more than Marcus had understood, was hers, and she went to stay in the West End house that had belonged to her grandmother. A Victorian semi that the family had kept and maintained over the decades with the same quiet intentionality that characterized everything the Aldridges held on to. She did not file for divorce immediately. Her lawyer had advised patience, and patience was, in her experience, almost always the correct advice. On the evening she moved out, she sat in her grandmother's kitchen with a cup of tea and looked at the backyard, bare and brown in December, and she thought about the gala. Not with bitterness exactly. Bitterness was an emotion she had moved through already. In the weeks before the gala, alone in rooms that Marcus didn't know she'd been alone in. What she felt now was closer to something like clarity. The cold, precise kind that comes after a fever breaks. She had known about Natasha since September. She had known the way women often know these things. A shift in texture. A change in the specific way. Marcus held his phone a Thursday evening where the explanation for his absence had been slightly too detailed. She had not confronted him. Confrontation required a kind of urgency, and urgency required believing that the outcome was in question. She had never believed the outcome was in question. What Claire had spent those weeks doing was not grieving in the way that people imagine grieving looks. She had been methodical was not quite the right word, but it was close. She had met with her lawyer. She had had a quiet conversation with her father. She had reviewed with her family's financial team the exact architecture of what was hers and what was Marcus's, and what existed in the complicated overlap between them. She had made decisions. And then she had gone to the gala in a pale gray dress and stood next to her father. And she had let Marcus look at that, the two of them together in that room, and she had let him understand what she had understood since September, that the only thing he had actually left was Claire. Everything else had never been entirely his to leave. There is a particular kind of man, and it's worth saying this carefully, because it's not about cruelty, not exactly, who builds his life on foundations he didn't lay, and then spends years believing the ground beneath him is his own creation. Marcus Holt was not a bad man in the way that the word bad implies a full accounting of choices made with clear eyes. He was something more common, and in its way, more troubling, a man who had been comfortable for long enough that he had mistaken comfort for invulnerability. He had thought he was leaving a marriage. He had not understood that he was stepping off the edge of something that had been holding him up for the entirety of his adult life. Natasha, to her credit, figured it out faster than he did. She had sent him a message in early November, 2 weeks after the gala, that said, simply, "I need some time to think about what I want." It was the message of someone who had done a calculation and found that the answer was not what they'd expected. They did not speak for a long time after that. Marcus spent the winter in the Bay Street office, and then in a rental in Yorkville, and then in a series of conversations with lawyers and financial advisors that had the quality of a person rereading a contract and finding, clause by clause, in which they had misread the original. The Morrison Group did not renew. The lease on the offices was not extended on favorable terms. A co-investment partnership that he had been counting on for Q1. None of this was visible from the outside as punishment. None of it was announced or performed. The Aldridge name did not appear in any of it, not explicitly. It was simply the natural consequence of relationships that were, in the end, predicated on a trust that no longer existed. The city moved on. The Children's Literacy Alliance announced it had exceeded its annual fundraising goal for the first time in 7 years. Patricia Sung sent Claire a bottle of wine to celebrate. Claire opened it on a Friday evening in her grandmother's kitchen and called her father, and they talked for 40 minutes about nothing important, about a renovation project he was considering, about the book she was reading, about a restaurant in Kensington Market that her cousin had recommended. She did not mention Marcus. There was, at a certain point, nothing left to say. People ask, sometimes, in the comments, in messages, in a particular way that strangers reach across the distance of a screen when a story has landed somewhere real for them, whether Claire's had regrets, whether it was worth it, whether, looking back, she wished she had done anything differently. Those aren't questions we can answer, because we weren't in that kitchen, and we weren't inside her when she looked out at the backyard in December and felt whatever she felt. But here is what we do know. We know that she chose at every point to act from a position of knowledge rather than reaction. We know that she did not let herself be made into a spectacle. We know that she walked into a room where she could have been humiliated, and she walked out of it instead, having simply and completely redrawn the map. She didn't win the way people imagine winning looks. There was no speech, no confrontation, no visible moment of triumph. There was just a woman in a pale gray dress standing next to her father, and a room full of people who understood exactly what that meant, and a man on the other side of that room who was only just beginning to understand it too. The room remembered. That was enough. That was, in the end, everything. If you're watching from somewhere in Canada tonight, drop your city in the comments. We love seeing where you all are. And if this story stayed with you, you know what to do. Subscribe, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and we'll see you in the next one.